Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at stellar evolution. Okay, now this is a concept in cosmology, and if you remember, cosmology is this idea of beginnings. Can we, from what we see, look backwards and have some idea of what would happen at the beginning or formation of the solar system or of the universe or of a star? So as we look at a star, we've been able to see that there's various types of stars. All of them share the same basic job. They squeeze gases into bigger gases. So they squeeze elements into larger elements. If there are very small stars and very large stars, if there are very hot stars and very cool stars, if there are different types of stars, along with other things that we've seen in the universe through the telescopes, is it possible that it's all part of the same story? That stars could change from one type of star into another based upon what's going on in their condition. And so the theory is called stellar evolution. It's the idea that certain huge stars at one time were not, and certain explosive stars that we've been able to see through the centuries are actually the end result of the life cycle of a star. And so let's look at the theories together. Generally, a star is an enormous collection of gases. So primarily light gases like hydrogen that has coalesced by gravity is the idea. And if there is enough of it and there is sufficient mass there that gravity is squeezing the inside of that sphere, then it will ignite and start to burn. And it is burning the fuel of the hydrogen itself as a means of trying to get out of the way, because all of that mass is in each other's way, and the gravity is pushing so tightly, and it's being so tightly packed that eventually it will ignite and shine as a star. So two things are happening. Once it ignites, then you're getting a force from the inside out because you have nuclear explosions happening on the center of that star. So you have forces out. Okay, in this picture, it's the red arrows. This is the forces out due to explosions. And then you have the forces in due to gravity, because gravity is pulling all of this matter together. And so you have this, it's called an equilibrium, all right? It's called a hydrostatic equilibrium. So how much mass of the star is it? Is it enormous? Then it can't have more gravity than the amount of nuclear energy shining out. Otherwise, it would collapse. And if there is more force coming out of nuclear energy than there is of the gravity, then it will expand. So a star's size has to do with how much stuff is in there, and also what's going on with this equilibrium. Is it collapsing somehow, or is it expanding in some way? So remember that it's by the squeezing inward of two hydrogen atoms that they eventually pull together into a helium atom, which has two protons in its nucleus. So two individual hydrogens, each with one proton, squeeze together, and now you have a new nucleus with two in it, and a huge amount of energy that comes out of that idea. Now, the idea of stellar evolution is based upon the different stars that have been seen. If you remember the HR diagram that we saw before, you had most stars that are in a main sequence stars that, if you were to graph them, were in that diagonal swipe in the middle of the graph. But you had some that were called dwarf stars that are very, very hot, but very, very dim. And then you have the opposite, where you have very cool stars, but very, very bright stars. Now, to try to understand why, because that's the ultimate question of any scientist, why is what I see what I see? Is there an explanation behind it? So the explanation is not that people have seen stars evolve, but they know the different stars that are out there, and stars are stars. And if all things being equal, what causes a star to get big or get small? What causes a star to be one color or another, what causes a star to explode, because mankind has seen exploding stars called supernova for centuries. So all of this trying to explain is in the idea of stellar evolution. So the theory that has been proposed from what has been seen starts with the idea of gases. Gases are very light, not very dense at all, but it is matter. And since matter exerts another gravitational force on other matter, eventually gases will condense and coalesce. And as they coalesce, as they condense, often they're going to start spinning. And if they spin, the more they condense, the faster they spin. Just like an ice skater will bring in her arms and spin faster. Exactly the same thing. As you get a spinning mass of gas, you'll eventually get a hot condensed object at the center of that spinning mass or spinning disk that is called a protostar. So it's the idea of a star will eventually form out of this. So this is a star that has not yet started to shine. It's condensed enough to have something there, but it hasn't had enough gravity for fusion to happen. So that's called a protostar. Eventually enough gravity pulls more material in and the star will ignite. Okay? As it ignites, it becomes stable, because if you remember, a stable star is forces out because of the fusion and forces in because of gravity, and they become stable, and that star is essentially a factory burning hydrogen and turning it into helium. Now, this is basically a picture of what is thought of as the evolution of stars. What will happen? So if you have a nebula that condenses into a protostar and it's of a small amount, so small like our sun, okay, the size of our sun, you will have a main sequence star. It will burn hydrogen. Eventually all the hydrogen will burn out. It'll get a little bit bigger. It'll burn helium and a little bit bigger as it's burning bigger and bigger elements. As it expands to do that, as it tries to burn bigger and bigger elements, it expands. If it expands, it cools down, because you have the same amount of stuff in a bigger space. And so it cools down and becomes towards red. And so our sun eventually is thought to become a red giant. Okay. Now, as that red giant is struggling to burn these bigger and bigger elements, eventually it can't handle it and it explodes. And it explodes with something dense at the middle and essentially gases being expelled into space. And that is called a planetary nebula. And there are many, many planetary nebula that have been discovered by the Hubble telescope all over the Milky Way, where these are thought to be at one time red giants that have exploded. Okay. Now, when all of the material eventually goes away, what's left is a white dwarf. It's the remnants of a star. It's not completely dead, but it's still burning a little bit, but it's very, very, very hot, and it's very, very, very dim. And so that enables people to say, okay, we've seen stars like this. So is it possible that all stars could be like this if they were the right size? And that's the idea here. If you have very, very big stars, very high mass stars, they will be main sequence, but they burn very quickly. And so they're not going to be yellow stars. They're going to be blue. They're going to be very, very hot blue stars that are burning through their hydrogen very, very quickly. So the sun is thought to be able to burn much longer than, say, a high mass star that is blue, and there are numerous stars like that. When it expands, when it runs out of hydrogen and starts expanding because it's burning bigger, it doesn't just become a red giant, it becomes a supergiant. So these are enormously bright, but very cool. They're still red because all of that material is spread out and cooled down the star. If it explodes then, it doesn't become a nebula, it becomes a supernova, which is so bright that you could even see a supernova during the daytime. it would be rivaling the sun in brightness. And then if it is a high mass star, it'll eventually become a neutron star, which we'll talk about. And if it's an extremely high mass star, a very, very biggest of the big stars, then it's thought to become a black hole. So that's the idea. So here's red giants. Okay, this is the largest red giant showing up at 4,500 Kelvin, and the sun is at about 5,800 Kelvin. Okay, so it's much cooler than the sun, but sending out a lot of light, so it's much brighter than the sun. Those are red giants. And then the planetary nebula has that kind of dead star on the inside with all the gases that has been exploded out from that. So it's not exactly a supernova, but there was an explosion there. Okay, so the core of the star could be the size of our Earth, but yet was from a whole star. So it's much denser than our Earth, a very, very dense object, probably the most dense that you can imagine. So a supergiant, so something that is bigger than our sun, would become a supergiant. So this is a supergiant picture compared to the sun. The sun is a little yellow spot compared to the supergiant, so much bigger. So we're talking way, way far out. So way past the orbit of Jupiter if our sun were a supergiant. Now our sun is not that big, so it would never become one, but that's the idea. And then when it finally runs out of steam, it will supernova and explode, and then what's left is a very, very dense core of a star called a neutron star. And some of these neutron stars will pulsate. It will spin that will pulse out a pattern, and you can actually measure these stars. I talked about parallax being a way to find the distances of stars closest to the Earth. Very far away stars, the ones that can be determined are these pulsars, because there is a math relationship between the amount of light and how fast it spins. And so the dim and the bright and the dim and the bright, almost like a lighthouse, how fast is that can determine how far away it is. And then finally, a black hole is a very, very massive star that explodes, and all that matter condenses into a space so small and such high gravity that even light cannot escape, and that's called a black hole.